if they're going to reset the clock for each of us individually, or is that just the aggregate time?
Can you see it? I just need
just the aggregate time.
As long as Susan can see it, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, well,
I'll
try to subtract.
Yeah.
I'm sure 80 minutes they've given us.
We started.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Terrific. Great.
This is great that everything was oversubscribed.
Yeah.
According to our new instructions.
Right.
Well, 11:40.
Yeah.
And then we got even more time.
Great. That's up for next one. I was hoping we could give us 5 minutes.
So thank you all for coming today and to attending this Discovery Cafe. I'm Meredith Fisher. I'm one of the partners at Partners Innovation Fund. We are the venture capital arm of Partners Healthcare System, and delighted to see so many of you interested in this very exciting and emerging area of research in artificial intelligence, and particularly this focused discussion in Discovery Cafe. The title of the cafe today is the Workforce, Humans, Machines, and the Future Delivery of Care. We have about an hour and 15 minutes for this, and that will include Q&A at the end. I think the idea will be that the panel will go on for about an hour or so and then allow for audience participation there. I'm not sure, do we have microphones that are set up, or will there be a passed mic for Q&A? Do we know? Okay, thank you. So mic will be passed. So during the Q&A session, if those of you who do have a question could raise your hand so that someone can bring a microphone to you, that'd be terrific. Help the panelists here. We're pleased to have a record turnout for the forum this year, and part of what my role will be just simply is to help us keep on time with this really esteemed panel, group of panel, and it's now my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator for this panel, which is Susan Hockfield. She's a member of the Partners Healthcare System Board, and also importantly, President Emerita, as well as also Professor of Neuroscience at MIT. So I think uniquely positioned to lead this discussion, and look forward to handing it over to her now. Thank you, and thanks to the rest of you for participating in this.
Thanks, Meredith. So welcome all to lunch. Continue eating while we talk. I promise you we will get to questions at the end, so save your questions up for the final part of the session. So I'm very excited about today's panel on AI in healthcare, and we talk about the human-machine interfaces, and I think about it, it's not the human-machine, it's human-machine-human, because what we're talking about would have been human-to-human interactions are now intermediated by some form of AI. And I'm just going to use AI as the title over a bunch of other activities, just to make it simpler. So what you're hearing about every day are new promises as how AI and other computational approaches are going to transform healthcare. But like all new technologies, delivering on the promise invariably faces the very real problem of how people are going to engage with these technologies. That is not a simple transformation wherever that happens. We hear about autonomous X. You fill in the X. Whether it's a car, whether it's a diagnostic, whether it's the menu for your dinner, are all great promises. But autonomous still is not entirely autonomous. Requires a human being at one end, or perhaps both of them. So this morning, actually, I loved sitting there listening to those talks with this panel in mind. This panel is about the workforce and how we get humans ready to develop, but we're talking about really manage their activities with AI. And I have to tell you, every one of those sessions this morning, I thought, wow, that's going to require more people, not less. Our fear is that it's going to take jobs away. It may take old jobs away. My own view is it's likely to bring new jobs toward us. Each of today's panel of the experts sits at that transition zone, looking right over the horizon. And we are going to really appreciate hearing from each of them their unique perspective on what this transition is going to look like. So most importantly, what we want to address is the impact of these new technologies on both providers and patients, and how we should be thinking about preparing tomorrow's workforce for a computationally enabled future. So what we're going to do is we're going to launch, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and give us a little state of the art, how are they seeing the field? And then we'll have a few more questions. And as I said at the end, I will try to keep at least 15 minutes aside for your questions, so keep them in mind. So Bill, do you want to launch for us?
Sure. Thanks very much, Susan. It's really a pleasure to be here. My thanks to the steering committee for the invitation and opportunity to participate. My name is Bill Thorwarth. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the American College of Radiology, an organization of about 37,000 radiologists around the country. But my background is that I practiced clinical radiology, predominantly interventional radiology, for about 30 years in a private practice in North Carolina. So I'm going to bring both of those perspectives to this discussion about workforce, because I really do think it's going to be an incredibly dynamic time from both perspectives. So from the college's perspective, the college, when I joined 4 years ago, they were just initiating a strategic planning session, out of which came a core purpose statement that is to serve patients and society, to empower our members, to advance the practice, science, and professions of radiological care. And also a vision statement that actually expands to have our members be universally recognized as advancing healthcare, not just radiological care, but healthcare. Because I think we're entering that team-based healthcare era, and I think that's critically important in the discussion of manpower, and particularly relative to artificial intelligence. Now, very remarkably to me, this strategic plan that we put together in 2014, quite frankly, despite the fact that the leadership of our new, relatively new Data Science Institute within the college, Bibb Allen, who's here today as the Chief Medical Officer, Keith Dreyer, who you all heard last night and of course was a coordinator of the course, as our Chief Data Science Officer, and Jim Brink, the now Chairman of our board, despite those folks being involved in that strategic planning process, only 4 years ago, quite frankly, AI and that was not even on our radar screen. It wasn't until we updated the plan in 2017 that data science became a core goal of our strategic plan. So again, I think it really just shows you how fast all of this is moving, and I think all the more reason why we have to be very attentive. We, as a membership organization, obviously we have to think of our members and what's their life going to be in this era. And most importantly, I think from an organizational standpoint, how do we educate and bring our members to an acceptance and understanding that this is a train that's left the station. You best get on board. And to paraphrase a statement that's been out there, that artificial intelligence won't replace radiologists, but radiologists that incorporate artificial intelligence into their practices will probably supplant those that don't. And that's really and quite honestly, we've gotten a very high degree of acceptance from our membership, it appears. But the other thing that I think from a manpower standpoint we really have to deal with is our membership is a very diverse group. There are folks with my color hair and having come out of training decades ago, to the new folks who are coming around and in training now. I will say we feel very fortunate that despite some of the lay press and hype that's out there about the impact of this, we're very pleased that this year the residency programs around the country were completely filled in the match, that the medical students are not being dissuaded by some of that, I think, overstated hype about replacement. But it does come down to the fact that our jobs, or the radiologist jobs in the future, are going to be very, very different than they were when I left practice 4 years ago, and very different than they are today. And I think what we need to be concentrating on is radiologists being sort of at the center and core of the information exchange that you heard so much about in the programs this morning. I think that if you're simply a report generator as a radiologist, then you're very susceptible to, quite frankly, being displaced. And a key point I hope I'm making is that our messaging to our members of all age groups and all stages of their careers has to be really very focused on what it is that they can expect. That they need to understand that, in fact, this is an empowering, to again go back to our core purpose statement, that this is an empowering technology. I went through my residency before MRI was in common use, before PET-CT. This is not just adopting a new modality. This is an entire change in the work and how you're going to do it and the role that you're going to play, again, in team-based healthcare. So.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Glenn?
I'm Glenn Cohen. I'm a professor at Harvard Law School. I'm also the faculty director of the Petrie-Flom Center there. I just finished a book on big data, healthcare, and bioethics that Cambridge University Press just released. I also run a program on precision medicine, AI, and the law. And I've worked with Otsuka in helping them launch their first ever digital medicine product that FDA has approved. I like to say I'm a lawyer, I'm an ethicist, and I'm also the product of overprotected Jewish parenting, which means that I'm a professional worrier. So what I do is mostly worry, 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 and then worry some more, right? So what is it that I'm worried about? Well, let me divide it between the patient side and the provider side. On the patient side, the key issue is trust. It always has been the core of the fiduciary relationship. Will patients trust a future of AI-mediated medicine the way they trust their physicians currently? And I like to think that there are some elements of this. I think of it as a triangle of a technology of trust. So three elements of the trust technology that can be interchangeable to some extent. One is privacy. Do patients believe that the data they provide their physicians, EHR, but also the data they provide non-physicians? So Internet of Things data, Fitbit data, social media data, purchasing data. Do they believe that that is private and protected, or do they believe they will be re-identifiable? Consent. Do they believe they're being asked to control the data? Are they being asked whether this is data they want to have shared? And finally, governance. What role do they have in deciding how the data is used after they have consented? And these are, in some senses, a triangle that has interchangeability. If you can give less privacy, you can guarantee de-identification less. You need to put more weight on consent on the one hand and governance on the other, and so on and so on and so forth. On the provider side, what is it that I hear? Trust is a big issue on the provider side as well, but that is to understand where do these algorithms come from, how do they work, and how, especially when you're talking about non-interpretable machine learning, that is machine learning that cannot be explained in human language, right? How do I know this is really going to improve patient care quality? Physicians are concerned about liability. When the model, the predictive analytics model, recommends the wrong thing and I have an adverse event for the patient, who's responsible? Who's going to be sued? Me or the patient? And then physicians themselves should be concerned, if they're not already, about their privacy. In that, as we integrate AI into the workforce and in machine learning and the like, it's not just patient outcomes that are going to be monitored, but also physician outcomes, right? And when you think about the interface, in particular in the US, of insurers and hospital management, to what extent are my outcomes being controlled, measured, directed? And really, I think we need a change in the orientation. The current generation of physicians can adapt. They can be retrofitted to understand and to use this stuff. But in reality, I think when we think about the medical school curriculum for the next century, it's going to look quite different than today's.
Thanks. Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Andriole. I'm Director of Research at the MGH and BWH Center for Clinical Data Science, which was born out of the Department of Radiology to MGH and followed with the Brigham, and is now a partners-wide activity. The goal of the center is to really develop and, most importantly, translate into the clinical arena AI applications that will improve either the workforce of providers, but also patient outcomes. And we believe the things you need to be successful in that arena are a couple of things. You need, we feel, the domain expertise, so the clinical acumen, which we have in spades across the partners enterprise. We also feel you need a data science expertise, which we had to bring in. We've been fortunate to bring in experts get them back from industry, Fitbit, Google. We have a data scientist who worked for the Air Force, and we're not entirely sure what he did, but he did something in terms of defense, but he's very good. We also feel you need software engineers to do this job, to actually translate back into the clinical arena. And I can program, but if my mom were sick, I wouldn't want my program to be used for her care. So we brought in professional software development engineers, and we feel this is multidisciplinary team science. Every project we start with is a clinical champion, and then a data scientist and a software development engineer who can actually, I see these tools working as a human computer interface. And in order to do that, we need to make this very usable for those folks at the point of care. And so we need to understand the workflow and understand how we can embed these tools so that they're useful in the clinical arena. And we're having difficulty competing with some of the salaries of some of the bigger industry players in this area. But what we have to offer is a tremendous amount of data and real-world applications of these things that can really impact care. And when I ask our data scientists, how did we get you? They talk about the fact that this is not a defense application, it's a healthcare application, that we have access to lots of data, and we're inundated with problems that are either fundamental research, biomarker discovery, some of which you heard this morning in the first look, or clinical applications as well. So we're interested in the whole research and development pipeline, and very importantly, translating back into the clinical arena. One thing I'd like to mention is that, everyone's picking on the radiologists, Bill, and saying we're going to replace the radiologists and the pathologists and so on, which I don't feel is going to happen just yet. But at the center, we're very interested in applications that are throughout, if I'm speaking just about imaging, throughout the medical imaging chain, so every point. And so I think there are going to be other workers whose jobs will also change beyond the radiologists, because we can see these applications fitting into a scanner. They're going to impact the technologist's job, reporting, and so forth. So I think it's a very, very exciting field, and I think that's what we have to bring the data scientist expertise to this problem. But I think we do have a little bit of an uphill battle in terms of hiring. I think we need to think about multidisciplinary team science to address this problem.
Great. Piyush.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Piyush Mathur. I lead workforce analytics at Johnson & Johnson. I recently joined Johnson & Johnson from a company called Nielsen, the TV ratings company. I spent about 23 years with that company. Most of the millennials ask me, what's wrong with this guy? 23 years, same company. And two things I kept doing. One was counting the number of bosses and the number of houses that I lived in. So it was a fair equation, 16 bosses and 16 houses in 23 years. And as I moved to J&J, I have my 17th boss, and I'm also shifting to my 17th house. So the equation remains fair. My wife is ready to become a relocation consultant. It's all good. It's all good. I used to do mostly on the commercial side. I used to lead businesses for Nielsen around the world. Then I pivoted to people analytics because I was very passionate about unlocking the power of people. And analytics is something that I did all my life for our clients. So people analytics kind of was my sweet spot. And I joined Johnson & Johnson to really devise their workforce for the future. We are about 140,000 employees. We are a Fortune 10 company. And there's so much of activity that is happening, you can imagine. I actually often say that if your business model is not changing in your company, then you should be worried whether you're in the right company, because everything is changing so drastically, and obviously it has so much of an impact on the workforce. From a Johnson & Johnson point of view, we want to embrace the power of AI in all its ways. And I will highlight 3 of them just to give you a flavor of where this is going. So from a pharmaceutical, so we have multiple businesses that we are in, $80 billion. One big business, about 50% of that is pharmaceuticals. So if I take the pharmaceuticals example, from an R&D perspective, there are 3 things that we're trying to use AI in. The first one is efficiency. Second is insights generation. And it's a lot about understanding where this is going. And the third one is developing new products. So if I talk about efficiency, and most companies talk about this, how this is going to impact clinical trials, how it will help us with regulatory operations. Yes, there's going to be an impact on the unskilled labor that we still have sitting in those units. And of course, the ones that do remain as part of that operation, I think will have to learn new skills. They'll have to learn to deal with new products, new interfaces, and develop a lot of those new skills. But I think we have to go beyond the efficiency piece. Efficiency piece is just one dimension. The other 2 dimensions are equally important. So the insight generation piece, it's really linking all the measurements that we do and the biology of those measurements into the disease. So we look forward to measuring all the metabolized measurements, image-based measurements, protein-based measurements, and trying to link that to diseases. So we are actually seeing where this is headed it's going to change the way we look at diseases. So in the past, you would call diabetes as diabetes, but in the future, it could be 4 different diseases. Today we see pneumonia and osteomyelitis as different diseases, but it comes from the same bacteria. So it actually might be one single disease in the future. So we believe this AI can really help us, take us to different places, and it'll completely redefine the way medicine is seen. One example that's already happening is in oncology, where we are about to launch a new product, which is targeting FGFR, which leads to some kinds of cancers. Initially it could go to a bladder cancer or a lung cancer, but that's not how we should be calling it. We should be targeting FGFR because that's the root cause that will be, leading to certain kinds of cancer. So for that, I think a lot will change in terms of the skills of the workforce. I think it'll have to really evolve from being just doing experiments to actually doing a lot more programs and creating more hypotheses through AI that will really help. And then finally, on the new products, I think I'm sure you all have read and heard about how this speech of mine could actually tell you the state of my depression. I mean, that's where this is going, right? If I read something, you take my voice sound bites and link it to a complex questionnaire designed by Mars Scale, you could actually start looking at the depression or the state of depression. I remember there's one company, Pearl Therapeutic, that came out with an app recently, got acquired, where just using the app had a therapeutic impact on the person. And I think, for us at Johnson & Johnson, we want to evolve and create these services. So just in a nutshell, these are the 3 things we believe that if we can, put together, we can really embrace AI and unlock the power of AI and create the future workforce for Johnson & Johnson.
Thanks, Piyush. Robert.
I'm Bob Birnbaum. I'm Vice President for Continuing Professional Development and Implementation Science at Partners. I have a dual background. I am trained as a psychiatrist. If it's any consolation, you do not sound depressed to me. And my focus has been on psychopharmacology. My PhD work was actually in molecular neurogenetics, and so I was very interested in brain plasticity and understanding how neural genes were turned on and turned off by stimuli. And so for me, knowledge acquisition, retention, utilization was very much linked to the underlying neurophysiologic principles like sensory input and brain adaptation. I say that by way of background because it got me interested, and Partners, interestingly enough, was a receptive organization to take someone of my background, which was quite macro in terms of looking at forces of adoption and having to do with how human beings operate and how systems and culture change operate, all the way down to a molecular level, and then find a niche for me in terms of looking at what we call knowledge engineering. How do we go about our strategy and Partners forward looking at knowledge engineering? And so we've been partnering with a number of companies and tech startups, also then collaborating with a number of groups that are interested in cracking the code on certain issues in healthcare as new models emerge. These could be disparities in care. It could have to do with new diagnostics or therapeutics. And just to give you a tactical sort of sampling of some of this, we've been doing heat mapping. We've been doing virtual online simulation. We've been looking at ways to have asynchronous virtual collaborative decision-making between patients and providers. We've been looking at the aspects of behavioral modification, gamification, behavioral economics, having to do with patient engagement. But all of this has been by way, from my perspective and as an umbrella, trying to think also as a clinician. I have a lab. It's a healthcare knowledge translation lab, an engineering lab, but also as a clinician and as a frontline clinician, thinking about how hard it has been. As I think most of you are aware of, surveys in healthcare show 50+% of physicians, if they had it to do over, would not go into healthcare. Bandwidth is very, very restricted. In terms of looking at engagement and adoption. People are burning out. It's a high priority for partners right now to look at provider burnout and provider overload and administrative burden. And so one aspect of this is I see the enormous promise and future of AI as a transformative and disruptive agent within healthcare. At the same time, I've got that old adage in my head of if you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And as we looked at certain aspects like imagery recognition and radiology, and we try to think of the broad sweep of how it's applicable to all other aspects of healthcare services and delivery, it's going to be a heavy lift, and there can often be unintended consequences. So that's my perspective.
Great, thank you. So we've gotten a glimpse. I'm going to come back to the panel and ask them to give us a snapshot of the more distant future. I just realized, you know, looking out at the audience, we hear a lot of talk about AI, kind of, you know, watch out, buckle your seatbelt. How many of you are already making plans or have already shifted your organization or your activities in the face of this impending AI? I'll just call it a wave rather than a tsunami. So you want to just raise your hand whether it's actually impacting you directly already? Okay, so maybe a quarter of you. Okay, so the rest of you, tighten your seatbelts a little tighter, I think. So what I want to ask the panel now is, so we kind of figure out where they are and what their concerns are. So if you were to look out into the future, and I'm talking maybe 20 years out, I don't know about you, but my crystal ball goes pretty fuzzy after 5 years. And so I understand we're asking you to talk about the miasma out there. But, you know, tell us, kind of, you know, give us a snapshot of what you imagine, some piece. I mean, obviously you don't give us the vast global effect of everything that you work on, but what is going to look different then than it looks today? And how are you preparing for that? So that's kind of, you know, to help these people, the other 3/4 who didn't raise their hand, you know, help them, give them the sense of what they could be thinking about, should be thinking about. And what I would suggest is, you know, you can be as optimistic as you want, or you can join Glenn in worrying and be a little bit more pessimistic. But just try and give us a picture of how you see in the area that you know well, what's going to look different in 20 years, and how are you preparing for it?
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more that 20 years is so far beyond at the pace that this is going. To project out that far is not just a challenge, but honestly, I think really impossible. But I do think that there's no question that this is I'm very optimistic, first of all, that this is an incredible, empowering technology or series of technologies, and that when Bob talked about the burnout factor, I think I deal with, we have a group of CEOs of 43 different medical specialty societies. We meet on a regular basis. And honestly, one of my bigger concerns is that I gave a presentation to that group a year ago, December, and it was deer in the headlights around the table. I mean, I think radiology, because of our past involvement with PACS and other high technology things, we're kind of ahead of the curve. But I don't think there's any question that the providers, and I'm not just talking about physician providers, but all healthcare providers are going to live in a completely different world. It's going to be very much data-driven. I think patients are going to benefit immeasurably from the fact that the coordination, just as we heard in some of the presentations earlier today, the coordination and personalization and precision of the care that they receive from all aspects is going to be just a quantum leap above what we're able to do today. So as I say, I think really I'm quite optimistic on the capabilities that this is going to provide. Now, as far as work, if we talk about workforce, in 2006, the WMIF, the American Association of Medical Colleges, projected that there'd be a 90,000 physician shortage by the year 2025. I think the combination of demographics, as far as the baby boomers coming through, the sophistication and the care that patients and the population desires, I think is going to make sure that, quite frankly, I'm very optimistic likewise that the workforce demands overall numerically are going to be as high, if not higher, than they are right now.
Bill, let me just press you a little bit because some of us aren't radiologists. So can you give me just one example of what's going to be different when I turn up, as I'm coughing and I might have pneumonia, so I go for an X-ray now, or when I go for my annual mammogram. So what will things look like to the best of your ability? Yeah,
no, I think things as far as the image acquisition is not going to maybe be drastically different now. Hopefully, as other more modalities have come along, the expanded use of them will get us away from, say, radiation-based modalities and the like. But I think from the patient's perspective, what they're going to expect and, quite frankly, look to, in our case, radiologists for, is a diagnostic answer that's integrated across radiology, pathology, laboratory, genomics. I think they're not, the piecemeal practice of medicine now, where it's aggregated, sent back kind of in various pieces to the primary care physician or specialist, is going to be a thing of the past. I think that the coordination of the care and we're going to be in the information business. I think very much so.
What you didn't say, and I think we'd all would hope you would say, is we're going to be able to diagnose your pneumonia before you're coughing or your breast cancer before there's a lump.
I don't think there's any question that some of the, again, back to the presentations, the prediction of susceptible populations, the customization of population screening, and again, going back to our core purpose statement, the reason why we put patients and society is because population health management is going to be such a critical part of what we do in the future, and we'll be able to do that kind of prediction based on huge databases.
Now I know you're all sitting there thinking it's not my turn next, but just to make it a little bit more interesting, Bob, I'm going to call on you next to give us that 20-year out view.
Well, I also am trying to figure out what I'm doing tomorrow, so that's difficult. But
this afternoon.
And I don't want to disagree at all with the optimism. I think the question is, and I think it's more complex and more nuanced, when I think about a patient presenting and I go out, I think a lot of it has to do with the level of expectations that we set. So, for example, we're quite good at conceptualization. When we first thought about connectivity and social networks, we thought about all of the benefits that came from that. But with it were enormous unintended consequences, especially as you got up to very large data sets, and then trying to figure out 5 years out or 10 years out what the unintended consequences of that might be. So let me just very briefly touch on allocation of the workforce. So I'm not in image recognition or radiology. I mean, psychiatry in some ways has falsely been accused of not having an empirical foundation. But it's striving to, and it is gaining a firm empirical foundation, but it takes into account the whole person. You have to keep in mind, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, that 70% of illness is due to social determinants of illness and not necessarily due to just the causes and pathophysiology of illness. So somebody comes into me and I can see where my workload could be vastly reduced. I could see where I would have enormous data sets that are now available, interrelational, interoperative, and interpretable, so that I have broad evidence-based practice to the point of care. But then what I see in the shift of how we train people and who will be available in our field is what do they do with that to then successfully implement it? I know our illusion to some degree is that the burden will be lifted off of us, and as practitioners will be even more available for the art of medicine with our patients. But at the same time, you're going to have to figure out, not falling to one end of the extreme or the other, how do you blend those two successfully? So I think a lot of that synthesis is going to somehow become more of what gets inculcated into the training and into the development. I don't see the workforce reducing. I actually, in many ways, see that it may be even more appealing to people to come into that kind of environment for healthcare.
Interesting. Kathy, you're nodding in a sense, so go ahead.
Yes, well, I'm going to be between the middle of both. I'm very excited about the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare, but I think we have to be cautious and understand the limitations. So currently, what we are seeing in healthcare, and I'll pick on radiology again, is a very narrow AI. So for example, we have applications that can identify a lung nodule that may cause significant morbidity and mortality in years, but may miss the pulmonary embolism that could cause death in seconds, minutes, hours. So we're seeing very, very specific applications. And I think that's going to go on for the next 5 years at least. And the reasons are, and I'll go from a technical standpoint here, in order to develop these algorithms, you need not only access to data, and because it's healthcare, we have patient privacy and security of data issues that we have to overcome. The other thing is, it's not just the data, but we need annotated data if we're going to be doing supervised machine learning. And annotated data or labeled data, that is, you know the answer to what's going on in the image or the lab test. And that's not so easy to get. It's a very time-consuming thing. In radiology, we can use technologies like natural language processing to pick out of the report what the radiologist thinks. And no offense intended, but that's not a true gold standard. It's an expert's opinion, but we don't have confirmation, for example, of pathology that says, yes, this is exactly what's going on. So we are limited in how we can do supervised machine learning because of data access and labeling of the data. I think the other piece that we have is medical students, although this may be changing and there's discussion at Harvard Medical School and other schools, as you know, to change the way we train medical students to be physicians and combining, there are a number of medical schools that are combining engineering training with medical students. But right now, I think we need multidisciplinary teams, and we need to bring the experts from the engineering schools and computer science into our fold to get them excited about what we're doing in order to make the advances in this. And I think I see artificial intelligence impacting all of healthcare at multiple points, hitting multiple staff and workforce, not just the physicians. But I still see it very much as a clinical decision support, whether it's automating something that's very manual or time-consuming to do, or whether it's alerting you to something that you may not have thought of at the point of care. I still see that. I can't think 20 years from now, but that's the way I see it, and I think we need to overcome some of these technical challenges as well as the workforce challenges.
Glenn?
You know, Freud said...
Sorry, I'm just going to get my Kleenex out because you're going to make me cry again about how...
Freud, and I'm saying this subconscious being on the stage with psychiatrists, in the introductory lectures of psychoanalysis, Freud said, mankind has suffered 3 great blows. Copernicus told us we're not the center of the universe. Darwin told us we're not the center of creation. And I, Sigmund Freud, will tell you you're not even the center of your own consciousness of your mind. What I want to tell you is that AI is going to give you a 4th blow as physicians, because in 20 years from now, you will not be the center of your own practices or the delivery of healthcare, right? Your role will be changing to one that will be computer-aided and computer-directed diagnosis and treatment. And the result will be that what you will do will continue to be very important, but it will not be the central decision maker in the autonomy that you have now. The other quote I want to share is from William Gibson, who wrote, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And that is to say that we're going to see the haves and the have-nots spread apart as these developments come 20 years from now. There will be people who will be able to take advantage of much of the system, and there will be cost reductions and there will be democratization, don't get me wrong. But I think the biggest problem we're going to face on a political level will be the further undermining of the conception of solidarity. In a world where your outcomes can be predicted and your health can be predicted far into the future with much greater accuracy, our sense of there, but for the grace of God, go I. That commitment to our fellow and that desire to basically support one another, I think will face major challenges. And in this respect, I think there's a very interesting divergence that's happening this month between the EU and the US. The EU is taking steps through the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, to essentially strongly hamper the use of data, the availability of data, and the ability to use machine learning and AI to make decision making. By contrast, in the United States, our main data privacy law dates back to 1996, and HIPAA's done a pretty good job for what it's supposed to do, which is regulate the flow of information from the healthcare setting in the physician's office. But it has nothing to say about Fitbit data, it has nothing to say about social media, it has nothing to do about socioeconomic status, the neighborhood you live in, the websites you look at. And in the future, that's going to be the palette of data that will help predict health, not merely the encounters in a healthcare office.
Piyush.
Yeah, if I go back 20 years, it would have been difficult for me to predict that my tests, X-rays, and CT scans were analyzed by robots. Or a Dutch company is able to, figure out through AI unnecessary hospitalizations. Or my speech today has a level of enthusiasm, right? So it was difficult for me 20 years ago to visualize this. So going forward 20 years, I think is very fuzzy for me. But I would tell you one thing that if you take away from this discussion is that there is a growth of mismatch of skills that we will see in the next 20 years. And I am also very optimistic. I think it'll pan out well. Human beings have overcome these kind of revolutions in the past, and I'm with that view. But how we get there will be a lot of confusion and chaos along the way. And I'll quote three pointers that I have read and discussed with several members of my team and my colleagues. The first one is, it's a fact. 65% of open roles today for admin assistants require an undergrad degree. 80% of admin assistants who actually do that role today do not have one. So 80% cannot apply to the 65% open job roles. So there is a skill mismatch today. If you go by the World Economic Forum report, it says 65% of children that are entering primary school today will do a job that does not exist today. So how do you prepare those children for those jobs that do not exist today? And then the third one is a McKinsey report I'm sure you've read, which talks about how there will be a shortfall of 40 million workers with tertiary education versus a surplus of about 90 to 95 million with low or mid-level skills. So what I am really concerned about is how we get there and how do we smoothen this transition. So I've been actually researching this for Johnson & Johnson in terms of what those future skills are. We're not thinking 20 years, we're thinking 5 years and saying, okay, these skills are important. Where are we today? How do we evolve those skills? And there's a simple thing that we came up with was, the rate of learning new skills should be faster than the current skills getting obsolete. And when we looked at this data, we found that in the 1920s, engineering skills had a half-life of 35 years. In the beginning of 2000, it was 5 years. And now it's much, much less. So how do you make sure that your workforce is evolving at that speed would be my biggest concern.
Yeah, not just workforce, but also education. So let's turn to education and preparation, because Piyush, you called out a couple of things that are kind of, hot button issues for me. And, I'm just guessing that everyone in this room went to college, but there is a growing enthusiasm in the United States against the value of a college education on one hand, and on the other hand, the understanding that a college education prepares you for your first job. And if we're not doing job preparation in the universities, what the heck are we doing? And so neither of those is an appropriate attitude to meet the demands that you're talking about. So not talking 20 years, now talking 5 years, 10 years, looking at the students who are entering medicine today, medical school today, or PhD programs, because this is a field that we've now, I think, all agreed is going to be a team sport, that we're going to have people coming from a lot of different disciplines in order to make good on the promises that we see. So what should we be thinking about? How should we be preparing our students? There's another piece. Kathy, you talked about people in these teams that may have degrees that are not MDs, but may have degrees in computer science or electrical engineering. And if you think about the structure of our jobs, where there is a promotion track for someone who has a particular set of degrees, one of the difficulties is figuring out how to bring people into our enterprises and have them not be second-class citizens, because there isn't a job track defined. So these are all part of this complex of a very rapidly changing world, just changing perhaps more rapidly. I don't know, I feel awfully old when I say, oh, the world's changing so fast. That's what my grandmother used to say. I'm not a grandmother yet, however. But this is this whole question of how do we, in our own domains, orchestrate or imagine orchestrating a transition of a workforce. And let me just, sorry, so before I let the panel loose, I'm going to just add one more thing, is that Kathy mentioned new medical schools that are doing, frankly, what HST, the Health Science and Technology program, was set up to do, which is to bring engineering together with science into medicine. And I know the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign has a new medical school that is engineering focused. There's a school in Texas, which one? Texas A&M also. And so, of course, I'm an enthusiast about that. But frankly, when you watch the trends in medical schools today, they're not going deeper into science and engineering. They're pulling back from science and engineering and heading toward the importance, not that it's not important, of the social sciences and humanities. And there are some schools that are even talking about abandoning calculus as a prerequisite. So here we are. What would be your prescription for the future? Let's see. Kathy, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple of changes that need to happen, and I'll start with the top. So I've been in academia all my life, so I'm kind of a snob in that regard. But I think things like promotions and how academia is structured needs to change. I think the Broad has gotten it correctly in that they have fundamental scientists, they have MDs, they have translational scientists. And in healthcare, translational science has been a bad word for the NIH until recently. And I think if we aren't putting our healthcare investments into translating things back into the clinical arena, then shame on us for just supporting fundamental research. But what the Broad does is it considers every person, regardless of their background, an integral member of the team. And I think that's point number one that you were alluding to. I think that's very, very important. I do think it's very difficult to know everything. We have, when I went to school, I studied biomedical electrical engineering and medicine, and I was an oddball. They were like, you want to combine medicine with engineering, what's that? It was last century, so it was a long time ago, but it was a very unique thing to do. Now I think it's absolutely critical that people get some understanding, and our data scientists and engineers are very, very fascinated by what's the application. They want to understand that application so they can design things better. And I think that the clinicians are very interested, and I think ultimately will need to have a certain level of understanding of these technologies in order to assess, do I use this tool? Is it good? Do I just believe advertisements? Or how do I evaluate this? This is a tool that can help me, and it's been evaluated properly. So both sides need to combine and have a little bit of an understanding of each piece. So, I loved calculus, and I hope they don't get rid of it, but I would say linear algebra, if they don't learn that, they can't do machine learning.
Or statistics, or statistics, right?
Or statistics. So I think that it's an area that, perhaps you can learn it without going through the traditional mechanisms. There's, we need to think about different educational models for adult learners and young adult learners. Much of it is interactive and online, and I know with the ACR and the Data Science Institute, we're rethinking how to educate even radiologists who have been in practice for years and do this online and make it interactive. But I think students learn differently today. I learned calculus by reading the book from front to the back, and that's not at all how they learn today. So I think we have to think about our academic models, our teaching models, and we need to understand the domain that we're going to apply these technologies in. I just don't see any other way in the near future other than multidisciplinary teams.
But Kathy, so you know I'm a big fan of multidisciplinary teams and spent a lot of my time in them and a lot of my time arranging for them. But one of the, just the facts is just mixing people up is not enough because they arrive with different languages, different vocabularies. Engineers and biologists have very different ideas of how you actually define a problem. And talking across these divides is very hard. And, it's worked in some of the activities we set up at MIT was actually basically educating one another and providing space for that, because otherwise people can, they can be sitting side by side but continue to work in their silos. And so how do you think about, in your own experience, how do you get people to really work on the same problem together?
Well, first of all, I think it's a good thing that they come at the problem from different directions. I think that helps to innovate. A model that we're using at the Center for Clinical Data Science, is we have what are called innovation fellows. And we have innovation fellows who are clinical innovation fellows. They are MDs. Most of them have also gotten a master's in informatics. And they really act as a bridge between our clinical and our technical teams. We also have innovation fellows who are data scientists. But these folks act, in a sense, as a translator. And we have multiple meetings. As I mentioned, we don't start a project without a clinical champion to begin with. And we have data scientists who are interested, very, very interested in learning the problem that they are applying to. So while they may be making innovations from a data science standpoint, which is maybe not of interest to this audience, they're also very interested in making innovations that are translatable and clinically relevant. And we have found this to be a successful model to have these innovation fellows who speak a little bit of both languages. And that's something that I do that has helped me to have so much fun in this field right now, is being able to speak a little bit of both languages. And I think it's difficult, though. It's difficult to get someone who is an expert clinician as well as an expert in data science. I think that's asking a lot of the human brain. And so, again, I don't see any other way around it, but I think these interface people are very, very important. And I'll take enthusiasm over someone wanting to learn another field over, a long resume. So.
Bill, what do you think about the educational challenges?
To step forward from to kind of undergraduate and medical school, I think if we get into postgraduate training, I think one of the real challenges going on right now is that the certifying bodies, and quite frankly, we all know that what residents in whatever specialty, they're training to pass the boards, whatever their board is. I actually exchanged emails over the weekend in preparation for this with the executive director of the American Board of Radiology, and attended 2 meetings last December with the American Board of Medical Specialties that oversees the 28 certifying boards, and this is nowhere to be found in their radar screen. And that's really a scary thought. As I mentioned, to give that presentation to the CEOs, it even now goes, as I say, extends to those certifying bodies. So to get them charged up about this being the future and this being something that they need to start setting the requirements and certifying obligations for is, I think, going to be a critical thing. Unfortunately, it comes at a terrible time for those in the medical field or even in the lay press know about the whole nightmare that's gone on about maintenance of certification. Though all of the boards are so preoccupied with that, they just don't have the bandwidth to step up and do this, what I think is going to be critical work in order to define what are, as Kathy said, you're not going to find somebody who's an expert in neurosurgery and an expert with PhD, or very few people who are going to be experts in informatics at the same time. But what they do need to be requiring, in my opinion, in the postgraduate, meaning residency level training, is core knowledge of how to incorporate all these talents and work in teams with these people so you're optimizing the care to the patient. That really is the bottom line, is how are we going to best care for the patients and for the population. There's not going to be any greater driver than those boards stepping up and making requirements along those lines.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We really do teach to the test.
Yes.
And our regulatory environment actually sets out our goalposts, right? And so if the regulatory, if our tests don't change, our education isn't going to change, although the students complain that we don't actually teach them what they're tested on. They've got to study it on their own, but I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and I think likewise, take one step back to the residency review committees that come in and say, does your residency provide this and this and this training? It's just not going to be there until there's an obligation to step up and have that knowledge base. So I think that really is a challenge. I will say, on the other side, going back to the early portions, I think we are blessed with the fact that the folks that are entering undergraduate school and medical school are now digital natives.
Right.
And so they come, where this has all been part of their life all along, and I think it's going to be a lot easier to keep that, to keep the momentum of that early high school, et cetera, level education going in the undergraduate phase.
So Bob, you're in an interesting discipline because we've been teaching beyond the discipline for a long time because psychiatry has been, shall we say, just a little short on effective treatments. Mm-hmm. I'll just say that as generously as I can. As a neuroscientist.
Depends on the affliction.
Yeah, speaking as a neuroscientist. So, so in a sense that you all have been teaching beyond what is clinically applicable for a long time, how is that going to change?
And I'm thinking about the previous discussion about workforce distribution related to education, because I think you just created a whole new field, and you may have done that unintentionally. But what's required when you have multidisciplinary teams and they don't speak the same language are people who are skilled at facilitating, translating those languages for each of those members. So if you find, and this has happened in psychiatry, 2 feral children that speak their own language that nobody else understands, they've developed that language, but they've developed that language in a utilitarian way that is useful to them as feral children. You just have to figure out how to bring them contextually into the wider environment and then translate what that is. Unique to psychiatry, I think there's an advantage and a leg up, and I think this may be what you're alluding to, that psychiatry has, by its very nature, been more holistic in staying in the gray zone. So at the point at which we found an empirical explanation for something like quaternary syphilis and the neuropsychiatric manifestations of it, and we identified the spirochete that was causing it, we gave it away to infectious disease. And we always stayed in that realm where, and it kind of attracts people who are very, very interested in trying to decipher the undecipherable. But that's a different kind of education, and it is certainly not the education that I went through. And I think there are now only these new models that are starting, and I couldn't agree more with the fact that you're really fighting upstream against the bureaucracy, which is frozen in amber in terms of trying to adapt to these new ways of teaching.
Yeah. Piyush, how are you all thinking about education?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say is, and I was reading this estimate by 2020, medical knowledge is going to double every 73 days. Now that
Sorry, that was kind of like my mind spinning. Okay, every 73 days. Okay.
So what we're thinking is the learning agility. How do we get the students to have that learning agility? Because that becomes so important. There will be so much stuff that will be coming out. How do they grasp? How does AI actually help them in grasping the stuff that is really critical for them to grasp in their area? So we are actually thinking that, and maybe this is more a 5-year outlook, how do we turn AI into augmented intelligence, right? So it's actually improving the intelligence of the humans as they are embracing AI. So how does that happen? And one of the examples I was discussing with my lead R&D scientist, and he was saying that in the future, what would be important for us would be computational scientists who are able to marry their judgment with the power of AI. And what he was saying is we don't have too many of them today, but let's say in the next 5 years, everybody should be able to do that. So people who come with a quantitative orientation, who have done some kind of programming, and now our scientists, have their judgment, how are they really able to marry that? So that would be one of the examples and the way we would like as corporates, the students that come out of the school to have. So
Glenn, I've saved you to the last of this round because I have a kind of a deeper concern that.
Great.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you have highlighted the privacy and ethical issues of this. Well, we don't know what they are, but that there are privacy and ethical issues in AI having greater and greater purchase on our lives. But one of the other, I don't know whether it's a consequence of all digital all the time and social media, but you raised earlier the point of an erosion of a sense of community and the public good. So one of the difficulties in, one of the challenges of a world where we each have access to our own data set, or whoever's data set, is in a sense, a reliance on the computation and less of a reliance on our neighbors, right? So how do we continue our focus on the common good, the public good, where so many of the incentives in this new world drive us toward the individual good? And this is another part of the university education debate in the country is a university education, is education a private good or a public good? But I actually believe that our various media benefits right now drive us away from a common good. But you've thought about this far more deeply than I. So talk to us a little bit about putting this into the workplace and what that does for our thought about what the workplace is, who are our neighbors, who are part of our team.
Yeah, I think your use of the word incentives is telling because, as I say, even though I'm a philosopher and an ethicist, I'm a believer in homo economicus. I'm a believer that people and systems respond to incentives. So the question is, what are the incentives set up for the implementation of AI in the workforce, right? And the idea that this is like a value neutral, panaceic kind of view of the world is wrong, right? We're going to get AI that responds to what the people who pay for the AI, who pay for the adoption, who use it, want. And those are the items that are going to be optimized, right? And it's going to optimize for certain portions of the population, but not for others. And in so doing, some of this becomes invisible. And I think actually as an interesting cautionary tale is to think about something that seems very far from healthcare, and that is the carceral state, policing, for example, and the use and the rollout of AI in the policing context and in the sentencing context. What is it that we have seen? First of all, we've seen that the results depend a lot on the data inputs you have, and the data inputs you have are not randomly distributed. They're distributed in such a way that reflects existing patterns of discrimination, right? If it turns out you police a particular community, you over-police them, then it turns out the data you feed in comes from the over-policed community and creates a cascade in the system. The same is true in terms of whose data makes it into the AI systems. And if you're talking about academic medical centers being the ones to gather the data, they reach a particular portion of the population and not others. The other is just a question of who watches the watchers, right? In a world where you can't patent your algorithm, where you can't copyright your algorithm, you're left to protect it through intellectual property through trade secrecy. Trade secrecy is not an obvious marriage to transparency for physicians and patients, to auditing towards openness to know what's going on, right? So until we resolve, I think, these kind of macro questions, what we're going to get will be AI systems that are largely secret, that are hard to explain or understand what's going on, that are producing results that suit those who are paying for those systems and incorporating those systems, but not necessarily targeting the social good.
Oh, more to worry about.
I told you worries.
I'm going to open the floor to questions. Do we have the mics around? So if you have a question, raise your hand. A mic will find you. And if that doesn't happen, oh, good. Great. So we've got to, okay, we'll start down here in front. And whoever the mic is, stand up, please. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm a ED and neuroradiologist at MGH, so I really appreciate this discussion on the imaging, on healthcare professions in general. I actually have some personal advice that I could use from the panel. And You know, like Glenn, I was raised in Brooklyn by professional warriors and now challenge my parents. And I spent last week going around visiting colleges with my daughter. So to back it up a little bit, what advice would you guys give to someone entering college about what skills to develop, what courses to take, what things to major in?
Great question. Anyone? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say you have to study what you're interested in as well. So I think that's very, very important. But I do think technical skills, and I'd love to see your daughter get technical skills. I'd love to see more women get into the field. When I was in school, women weren't exactly encouraged to go into engineering and science pursuits. So I think it's very, very important. But I do think you need to have some of the traditional background foundation to be able to do some of this work. And that includes mathematics and science. And then you can take and get an expert feel for the area that you might apply it to. But I think you have to go on what you're interested in, number one, but also prepare with the basics. And that's why I think that the fundamental system, while broken in some ways, still has so many good aspects to it.
We're going to move the mic fast. Good, here we go.
So my name is Robert Saxton. I've been practicing bone marrow transplant for over 30 years. And I'm going to say to all the clinicians in the room that may not have responded to the question of whether AI has already interfaced in your world, the answer is absolutely yes. For anybody who's had computerized drug entry, you've interfaced AI. What I find most comical is when I know I have to give a patient a drug that may have a complication where the patient already has manifested that particular event, for example, a low platelet count, but I have to give that drug because that drug is necessary to save that patient's life, my interface shows up, warning, with a big question mark, whether I know what I'm doing. I'm waiting for it to say, are you sure? Absolutely sure, doctor, question mark. And so what I think is going to happen is it's going to erode the physician's self-confidence to some extent, potentially increasing performance anxiety. And I really want the panel to comment on that because I think it's going to ultimately change how physicians view themselves, let alone view the care of a patient.
Bob.
So if you look at systems that have enterprise-level EMRs and you look at the CCDS integration into it and the best practice alerts, you find not uncommonly that physicians override the best practice alerts 90+% of the time. And my experience as a clinician is very similar in a very different field, but it exactly mirrors your experience. Some of the approaches now, and there have been approaches looking at eliminating best practice alerts, and this is where I don't have the technical expertise to talk about the underpinnings of AI, but that what you're experiencing this, I would rather do this than do this, and the machine telling you that you're an idiot and you did Y and you should do X, is a limitation of the light AI that's being applied. Not again to portray a panacea, but if you move it upstream, more proximal, so that when the person is ordering the hemoglobin A1C, the machine knows that you're thinking diabetes and can start gaining a way of guiding you through less clicks and more credible information. But I think you're talking about a fascinating watershed, which is to what degree do you have a tarnished asset and that the physician population in general, and again, it may be a pulse labeling and generational, but is so jaded by what they've seen that they won't adopt it successfully. That was my quick answer.
Right. But actually, we'll get Glenn, because we won't all answer every question.
Yeah, so I'll just say that this is actually a problem of choice architecture and design, right? Nudges and all this, and that there are questions about what the best outcome is, right? There is something known as alert fatigue, which is what you sounds like you're experiencing, right? It may, so one of the possibilities, it may make your life worse, but it may actually make the insurer's life better across time, might make the hospital's life better. But one thing to be afraid of, and you know, I raise lawyers who sue all of you for a living, right? This is what I do for work, is to say, if you override the alert 17 times, and 16 of the times you should have pushed that, you were correct to override it, and the 17th time is the one where the patient has the adverse event, you better be expecting that in the deposition and on the witness stand, someone will say, how many times, doctor, did you ignore that alert? Was it once? Was it twice? 17 times. 17 times. And you get the idea.
Yeah. Next question. Yep, go ahead, please.
I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but I'm also a physician entrepreneur, and I'm interested in the adaptation of AI as it interfaces not with professionals, but with consumers. Maybe you could comment on that extra layer of, input.
Interesting. Piyush, is this in yours or Bill?
Well, I think
yeah.
we've already seen that. I mean, again, I did interventional radiology, and my practice 10 or 15 years ago, rarely did I get a question from a patient who had been, hadn't asked Dr. Google what to do, and now I think it's only going to accelerate that because they're going to come up with, AI algorithm such and such got this press, and it recommended this pathway, and I think it's going to be a real challenge for physicians. I think they're going to have to stay clearly very current. I think they're going to have to be willing to answer and have those conversations. I think patients are progressively critical consumers of what they're getting in healthcare, not just from a cost standpoint, but from a quality and performance standpoint. So I just think that's going to be part of the business.
But Bill, the status quo right now is oppositional. So why shouldn't we be providing not just a painful EMR service for our doctors, but also a vehicle, for our patients. So rather than it being oppositional, we should really make an effort to get on the same page. Sure. Next.
Hi, I'm a primary care doctor, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what you said about medical knowledge increasing every 73 days as a really doubling as a really terrifying statistic. Yeah. And I also wanted to talk, I was incredibly impressed by the breadth and depth of each of the presentations this morning for all of these different applications of AI. But I was also a little bit surprised to realize how siloed each of those were. And I'm curious about how at a place like MGH and Partners, where there's so many different things happening, we can imagine a patient who needs both a neurosurgeon who's got access to the radiology information and the oncogene information and the drug information. And how do we start to think about really linking these systems to be able to provide a seamless patient care experience? And I think, Kathy, you mentioned that in your mind that's like at least 5 years away. And what is MGH doing or Partners doing about that?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. Great question. And Kathy, why don't you answer that for us?
So I think it does go back to multidisciplinary teams, and I think healthcare is moving that way from siloed trainings, siloed care, to multidisciplinary teams. We see surgeons who are experts in imaging because they use imaging during their surgeries and so forth. I think the ability to develop these algorithms that are including pixel data such as imaging, as well as genomic data, risk factors, social factors, is something that we're beginning to do. And I think with interesting results, perhaps. And I think that's important to do. But it's a culture of we've all sort of work on our own silos. And through the center, actually, one of the really pleasant surprises that we're finding is that there are people who are doing the type of work that we're interested in all different departments across the healthcare enterprise. And we need to come together to work out these problems. Obviously, it's there's so much to be done. We could divide it with everyone in this room and we'd still have a ton more to do. So we're attacking problems that we feel from a technical standpoint, we have the proper data, we have the compute to do, there's a translational aspect to it and so forth. We can't do everything. There's so many more things that we would love to do that we can't, so we just don't have the bandwidth. But I think you're absolutely right. We have to, again, embrace team science and team healthcare.
So there are a lot of hands up. So do you mind, let's get another question.
Hi, I'm a Canadian healthcare lawyer, and I'm working on a project to license an app from the UK that uses artificial intelligence, has access to probably 30 million patient charts. Wow. And in licensing it in Canada, we have a bit of an issue because we have a public healthcare system, and we have significant barriers in charging for physician care for medically necessary services. So the answer that I gave to the client is, let's use nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners are not covered by the Canada Health Act, so there are no barriers to any legislative provisions that would prohibit a nurse practitioner from providing services to Canadians anywhere in Canada through an app on their consumer phone. And it's bootstrapped to 30 million patient charts, and they use Watson to do the diagnoses. And it's only for primary care. So the question to you is, would you rather access the nurse practitioner bootstrapped to 30 million charts and Watson, or go to your local family physician I'm 55 years old, who's 55 years old for primary care? And the stats from the UK company that holds this license indicates that only 10% of interactions between the consumer and the computer actually requires access to a nurse practitioner or a physician. So 9 out of 10 contacts are resolved through the consumer and Watson, accessing 30 million patient charts. So would you rather see your 55, 60-year-old isolated family physician, or would you rather access the nurse practitioner on the app?
So is that a question, or is that a position statement? Go ahead, Bill.
I'll say I flew up here from Washington and got on the plane, and realizing that the computer did most of the flying of the plane. I would not have gotten on the plane had there not been a pilot in the cabin when I got onto the plane. So I guess my feeling is would I want my 55-year-old physician to be able to demonstrate to me that he or she was up to date on current literature and could answer my questions that might be posed by the exploration of the AI that's available to the public? Absolutely. Would I want to go in and look at an app on my phone and even bypass, as you say, the nurse practitioner or advanced level provider and simply go by that app that's backed up by Watson and 30 million charts across the ocean? Not for me, thank you.
Yeah, this is the autonomous X question.
Just to clarify, when you can push a button, and on your screen is the clinician. And there are access issues. When we live in Boston, we live in Toronto, we have access to primary care. This is Canada, we have the far north, we have access issues.
Is the mic here? Please, go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, I'm asked the question to follow up when you say what education needed. I think I like to recommend learn mathematics and physics. Most importantly, because now if we blindly believe in AI, we need somebody in the organization should overview knowledge. And he said, this is wrong. This is against the basic principle. Don't accept the result. I really like to see that. I'm a physicist. I really think that's very important. That we cannot blindly believe whatever developed by the algorithm. The algorithm was developed by some engineers. So learn physics. Rule number 1.
Thank you. Next question. I don't think that wasn't a question. That was a point of view, and I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah, this is partly a question and partly a point of view, because you already said that. It's wonderful that the whole gamut of data and AI was covered there. But there were 2 things that kept repeating there. One was when Kathy was saying, it's not particularly to you, but when you said there's a lot more data, so it's easier, it became easier to attract talent from other fields. Just being in partners, does it allow you to use more data? Or being in partners facilitated you to get more data?
Good question.
So the question is, why do we have access to such data? And that's because it is our institution's data.
How does it become your institution's data?
I'm sorry?
How does it become your institution's data?
Because we are holding the data for the patients, and we are bound by legal, you can tell me the legalities, for patient privacy and security. We can't retrospectively consent all of the patients that we're using their data. We're using data that's already been created, and it would be very, very costly and very, very difficult to consent all the patients to do that. So we are bound in terms of being able to let data outside of our institution. So that's one reason, and there's tremendous value in the data. A radiologist, by the way, is a physician. They don't just do pattern recognition in an image. They do lots of other things like recommend other tests, make recommendations around treatment, diagnoses, and so forth. And so there's a lot of contextual knowledge that has gone into all the data that's been collected. It's not just we're acquiring data. So there is value in the data. We have the ability to access that data. But if you want, and I'm very positive about being able to use AI to treat patients in underserved areas. But what has to happen is, if we hopefully we have fairly heterogeneous data sets throughout the partners organization because it's a multicultural city. But what would have to happen from a technical standpoint once the models are built is they need to be retrained in a certain extent on the data of that particular patient population. So UK, very different patient population from Canada perhaps. And so if the data isn't retrained on that particular, and this is just good science. Yeah. This is just good science, using a data set that is broad, that has everything from very subtle to very obvious and normal in between. And I think those are some of the errors that are being made today in the field, and not having proper data sets and so forth.
Part of your answer.
I'm sorry, our time is up. I am very sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for staying with us through the whole, however long it's been, and thank my panelists for their insights. Okay, all right.